The year was 1814, and the streets of Madrid erupted in celebration as Ferdinand VII returned from exile. Crowds threw flowers, church bells rang across the city, and thousands of Spanish subjects fell to their knees in worship of their restored monarch. They called him El Deseado, the desired one, believing their prayers had finally been answered. But behind the gilded carriage windows and royal silks lay a secret so grotesque, so medically impossible, that it would transform this celebration into one of history's greatest tragedies. What the cheering masses didn't know was that their beloved king harbored a physical abnormality so severe that it had already destroyed one marriage and would claim the lives of multiple wives. Ferdinand VII wasn't just politically corrupt or morally bankrupt like so many rulers of his era. He was biologically cursed in ways that defied medical understanding, cursed with an anatomical monstrosity that would turn every attempt at intimacy into a nightmare of medieval proportions. The secret that Ferdinand carried beneath his royal robes was more than just a personal burden. It was a ticking time bomb that would explode across Spanish society, leaving a trail of dead wives, traumatized physicians, and a kingdom that crumbled under the weight of one man's impossible shame. Today we're going to expose the horrifying truth about Ferdinand VII, a monarch whose reign of terror began not in the throne room, but in the bedchamber. Before we dive into these shocking revelations, if you're fascinated by the dark secrets of history that textbooks never dare mention, smash that like button and subscribe for more content that uncovers the truth behind the myths. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's incredible that we can explore these forbidden chapters of history together from every corner of the globe. Ferdinand VII was born into a genetic nightmare that had been centuries in the making. The Spanish royal family had spent generations perfecting the art of destroying their own bloodline through systematic inbreeding. Cousins married cousins, uncles wed nieces, and the Habsburg jaw wasn't the only deformity that plagued these cursed dynasties. When Ferdinand emerged from this toxic genetic pool in 1784, nature had prepared a particularly cruel joke that would define every moment of his existence. The young prince appeared normal enough during his early childhood, but as he entered adolescence, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Court physicians, bound by oaths of secrecy, began documenting an anatomical development that belonged more in the realm of mythology than medical reality. Ferdinand's male anatomy was growing in ways that violated every principle of normal human development, expanding to dimensions and taking on shapes that seemed almost alien in their impossibility. By the time Ferdinand reached his teenage years, the full horror of his condition had become undeniable. His member had grown to lengths that exceeded anything in recorded medical literature. But size was only part of the nightmare. The shape itself defied comprehension, thin at the base like a pencil, but expanding to grotesque proportions at the tip. Contemporary physicians described it as resembling a club or walking stick, an instrument of torture rather than an organ of procreation. The psychological impact on the young prince was devastating beyond measure. In an era when masculine anatomy was judged by classical Greek standards, where smaller and more proportioned was considered aristocratic, Ferdinand found himself branded as a freak of nature. The very thing that modern men might envy became his deepest source of shame and the foundation of a paranoia that would later consume entire kingdoms. Ferdinand learned early that he was an object of mockery throughout the Spanish court. Servants giggled behind doorways, courtiers made subtle jokes, and foreign diplomats reported back to their masters about the Spanish embarrassment. This constant humiliation bred a festering resentment that transformed a potentially weak-willed prince into one of history's most vindictive tyrants. Every bow from a subject, every formal address from an advisor, every arranged smile from a potential bride. Ferdinand saw mockery lurking behind each gesture. The prince began using his royal power to compensate for the powerlessness he felt about his cursed anatomy. Servants who displeased him didn't just face dismissal. they faced exile or worse. When a young page accidentally glimpsed Ferdinand changing clothes, the boy wasn't simply sent away. Ferdinand had him flogged and his entire family banished from Madrid, establishing an early pattern of disproportionate revenge that would characterize his entire reign. As Ferdinand approached marriageable age, the full scope of his challenge became clear to the royal physicians tasked with preparing him for his dynastic duties. Dr. Francisco Flores, the king's personal doctor, left behind secret medical notes that paint a picture of biological impossibility. The measurements and descriptions preserved in these clandestine documents describe an organ so massive and misshapen that normal intimate relations would be not just difficult, but potentially fatal for any woman unfortunate enough to become Ferdinand's bride. The medical establishment faced an unprecedented challenge. How do you prepare a future king for marriage when his anatomy makes the basic requirements of royal succession nearly impossible? The answer came in the form of specialized equipment that transformed the royal workshops into something resembling a medieval torture chamber. Master craftsmen, sworn to absolute secrecy under penalty of death, began creating what they euphemistically called marital aids: cushions, supports, and various implements designed to make Ferdinand's sexual encounters possible while minimizing the physical damage to his partners. These craftsmen became specialists in perversion, developing increasingly sophisticated devices that pushed the boundaries of human engineering. Their workshops, hidden in the deepest chambers of the royal palace, contained equipment that looked more suited to a surgeon's table than a wedding chamber. Adjustable cushions, restraining devices, and various implements designed to accommodate Ferdinand's impossible anatomy while keeping his wives alive through the ordeal. Ferdinand's desperation to find solutions to his condition led him down increasingly dark paths. He consulted alchemists who promised magical cures, foreign physicians who claimed expertise in royal anatomical problems, and even practitioners of darker arts who suggested that his deformity might be overcome through supernatural intervention. The prince consumed potions made from ground rhinoceros horn, powdered pearls, and rare herbs that were supposed to normalize his cursed anatomy or enhance his fertility, despite its bizarre configuration. The psychological toll of living with this secret began manifesting in disturbing ways throughout Ferdinand's youth. He developed an obsession with mirrors, spending hours examining his deformity and trying to devise ways to conceal or correct it. He began conducting crude surgical experiments on himself, attempting to modify his anatomy with whatever tools he could acquire. These desperate self-mutilation attempts only made his condition worse, while adding layers of psychological trauma to his already damaged psyche. Ferdinand's relationship with his parents became another source of torment as he grew into adulthood. His father, Charles IV, was a weak ruler more interested in hunting than governing, while his mother, Maria Louisa, openly flaunted her affair with the Prime Minister. Ferdinand watched this daily humiliation of royal dignity, while simultaneously dealing with whispers about his own shameful secret. The combination of political dysfunction and personal anatomical horror created a perfect storm of resentment that would later explode across Spanish society. The court atmosphere during Ferdinand's youth was one of barely contained hysteria. Everyone knew something was wrong with the prince, but no one dared speak openly about the nature of his affliction. Conversations stopped when Ferdinand entered rooms, servants avoided eye contact, and potential brides were carefully briefed by their families about the special circumstances they might encounter in a Spanish royal marriage. This conspiracy of silence created a pressure cooker environment that pushed Ferdinand deeper into paranoia and rage. Foreign intelligence services began compiling detailed reports about Ferdinand's condition, recognizing that Spain's future stability might depend on understanding the full extent of the prince's personal problems. Diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals that European courts were already questioning whether Ferdinand would be capable of producing legitimate heirs. and some nations began positioning themselves to take advantage of a potential succession crisis that seemed inevitable given the prince's anatomical challenges. The Spanish people, unaware of their future king's intimate struggles, continued to see Ferdinand as a symbol of hope for national renewal. They called him El Deseado and placed their faith in his ability to restore Spain's former glory. The tragic irony was that the man they believed would save their nation was already broken beyond repair, cursed with a condition that would make normal rule impossible and turn every attempt at creating a royal dynasty into a horror story that would claim multiple lives. As Ferdinand approached his first marriage, the stage was set for one of history's most disturbing royal unions. The young prince carried within his deformed anatomy not just his own personal curse, but the seeds of destruction for an entire kingdom. His wedding night would become the first in a series of intimate disasters that would leave a trail of traumatized wives, terrified physicians, and ultimately, a Spanish empire that collapsed under the weight of one man's impossible shame. The year 1802 marked the beginning of Ferdinand's marital nightmare, when arrangements were finalized for his union with Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. The young princess arrived in Madrid, filled with romantic dreams about her future husband, having heard whispers that he was called the Desired One by his supporters. She imagined herself marrying a fairy tale prince who would sweep her off her feet and create a love story worthy of the greatest poets. What awaited her instead was a horror beyond her most terrifying nightmares. The wedding ceremony itself was a magnificent spectacle that fooled everyone watching from the cathedral pews. Ferdinand appeared every inch the perfect royal groom, charming and attentive to his beautiful bride. Maria Antonia glowed with happiness as she walked down the aisle, her silk train trailing behind her like a river of dreams. The music soared, the crowds cheered, and for a few precious hours, it seemed like Spain had finally found its fairy tale ending. But fairy tales end when the cathedral doors close and real life begins. The first warning signs came when Ferdinand's personal valet approached Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting with requests that made no sense to anyone unfamiliar with the prince's condition. Special equipment needed to be brought to the bridal chamber, they were told. Custom cushions, bottles of medicinal oils, and various implements that looked more suited to a physician's office than a romantic wedding night. Maria Antonia, sheltered and innocent like most royal brides of her era, understood none of these preparations. Her education had focused on languages, music, and religious instruction, with the basic facts of married life explained only in the vaguest terms by nervous older women who themselves knew little about what she was about to face. When the moment came for her husband to enter the bridal chamber, Maria Antonia was completely unprepared for the biological impossibility that awaited her. The princess's first glimpse of Ferdinand's naked form sent her into hysterics that echoed through the palace corridors. Witnesses described her backing against the wall, pointing and screaming as if she had encountered a demon from the depths of hell itself. The thing that hung between Ferdinand's legs bore no resemblance to anything she had been told to expect. It was massive beyond comprehension, grotesquely shaped and covered with strange growths that seemed almost parasitic in nature. What followed was less a romantic consummation than a medical emergency. Ferdinand's specially trained physicians had to be summoned to explain to the traumatized princess what would be required of her. The custom equipment was arranged with clinical precision, creating what looked more like a surgical theatre than a marriage bed. The oils and salves were applied not for pleasure, but for basic survival, as Ferdinand's anatomical monstrosity posed genuine physical danger to any woman who attempted intimate contact. The wedding night became a nightmare that would haunt both participants for the rest of their lives. Despite all the preparations and specialized equipment, Ferdinand's condition made normal marital relations impossible. The screams that echoed through the palace that night were not cries of passion, but genuine terror and agony. Servants discovered blood-stained sheets and broken furniture the next morning. Evidence of an encounter that resembled medieval torture more than the union of royal newlyweds Maria Antonia never recovered from that first traumatic experience. Court observers noted that she developed a pronounced stutter and would visibly flinch whenever Ferdinand entered a room. She began experiencing what palace physicians called hysterical episodes, but which modern medicine would recognize as severe symptoms of sexual trauma. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that she often woke screaming from nightmares, calling out warnings about monsters that haunted her dreams. Ferdinand's reaction to his wife's obvious revulsion revealed the depths of his narcissistic cruelty. Rather than showing compassion for her suffering, he interpreted her terror as a personal insult to his royal dignity. His paranoia, already legendary among court observers, reached new heights as he convinced himself that Maria Antonia was conspiring with foreign enemies to mock his condition and undermine his authority. The pressure to produce an heir transformed their marriage into a ritualized horror show that played out regularly in the royal chambers. Ferdinand would summon his team of physicians who would prepare the room with its specialized equipment. Like surgeons preparing for a complex operation, Maria Antonia would be administered enough laudanum to make her compliant, but not catatonic, creating a zombie-like state that allowed the procedure to continue despite her obvious psychological trauma. These encounters became increasingly elaborate as Ferdinand's desperation grew. He began timing their intimate attempts according to astrological charts and lunar cycles, consulting astronomers and even practitioners of darker arts who promised to align celestial forces in favor of royal conception. The palace transformed into a haven for charlatans and con artists who fed on the king's desperation, selling him fertility potions, magical amulets, and ritual ceremonies that promised to overcome the curse of his deformed anatomy. The most disturbing aspect of Ferdinand's quest for an heir was his decision to invite foreign medical experts to observe his marital encounters. Desperate for solutions to his anatomical challenges, the king allowed German anatomists and French physicians to witness his intimate failures, transforming his marriage bed into a grotesque medical theatre. These voyeuristic consultations were documented in detailed notes and sketches that were later circulated among European medical schools, making Ferdinand's sexual dysfunction a subject of academic study across the continent. Maria Antonia, subjected to this parade of foreign observers examining her most intimate moments, began showing signs of complete psychological collapse. She stopped eating regularly, lost dangerous amounts of weight, and developed a 1,000-yard stare that servants found more frightening than her earlier outbursts of hysteria. The young queen had become a living ghost, haunting the corridors of a palace that had transformed into her personal hell. The political ramifications of Ferdinand's intimate failures began rippling outward beyond the palace walls. Spain's American colonies, already restless under colonial rule, began pointing to their king's inability to produce legitimate heirs as evidence of divine displeasure with Bourbon rule. Revolutionary propaganda depicted Ferdinand as a sexually impotent tyrant whose physical inadequacies mirrored his political incompetence, providing perfect ammunition for independence movements stretching from Mexico to Argentina. Ferdinand's response to these mounting challenges revealed his characteristic blend of paranoia and brutality. He launched new waves of purges targeting anyone suspected of spreading rumors about his condition or supporting colonial independence. The Spanish Inquisition, which he had restored immediately upon returning to power, began investigating cases of what they called sexual slander against the crown, creating a climate of terror where even private conversations between married couples could result in imprisonment or death. The king's obsession with maintaining secrecy about his condition reached absurd and expensive proportions. He ordered the construction of hidden passages throughout the palace so he could move between chambers without being observed by servants. Mirrors were installed at strategic angles to detect potential eavesdroppers, and he employed networks of spies whose sole responsibility was monitoring palace gossip about the royal marriage. The cost of this paranoid infrastructure drained royal coffers that might have been used to address Spain's mounting economic crisis. Meanwhile, Maria Antonia's health continued deteriorating under the combined assault of her husband's sexual violence and psychological terrorism. Palace physicians began documenting what they called phantom pregnancies, periods where the Queen would exhibit signs of carrying a child despite the medical impossibility of conception given Ferdinand's condition. These episodes provided the king with brief moments of euphoric hope, followed by crushing disappointment when reality inevitably reasserted itself. The phantom pregnancies became sources of bitter irony in a court already drowning in dysfunction. Servants would whisper about Ferdinand pacing outside his wife's chambers during these episodes, alternately praying and cursing as if divine intervention might somehow overcome the mechanical impossibility of their situation. When each phantom pregnancy inevitably ended, Ferdinand would sink into black depressions that paralyzed the Spanish government for weeks at a time, leaving the kingdom rudderless during increasingly critical moments in its history. In 1807, after 5 years of this matrimonial nightmare, Maria Antonia finally found escape through the only means available to royal women of her era. Death came to her at the age of 21, officially attributed to fever and complications from her delicate constitution, but private letters from palace staff suggest she may have hastened her own end through subtle forms of self-harm, choosing permanent escape over continued subjection to Ferdinand's anatomical torture chamber. Maria Antonia's final words, according to her confessor, were a prayer of gratitude for her approaching liberation from what she called the earthly purgatory of royal duty. Her death sent shockwaves through the Spanish court, but Ferdinand's reaction revealed the true depths of his psychological deterioration. Rather than mourning his wife, he became convinced that enemies had murdered her to prevent him from producing an heir who might stabilize his troubled reign. The king ordered multiple autopsies performed by different physicians, each searching for evidence of poison that never materialized. Several of Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting were arrested on suspicion of conspiracy, subjected to interrogations that bordered on torture, as Ferdinand desperately sought someone to blame for his own anatomical failures. The palace apothecary was found dead in his chambers just days after the Queen's passing, his mysterious demise fueling rumours that he had been eliminated to prevent him from revealing the true nature of the royal medical situation. Ferdinand's behaviour during Maria Antonia's funeral became a macabre spectacle that horrified even his most loyal supporters. The king insisted on viewing the corpse multiple times during the preparation process, touching the lifeless flesh while muttering about the wasted potential of her womb. He commissioned an elaborate death mask and displayed it prominently in his private chambers, where visitors reported witnessing him conducting one-sided conversations with the plaster representation of his deceased wife's face. But Ferdinand's quest for dynastic succession could not be delayed by grief or guilt. Within months of burying his first wife, his advisors were already negotiating for a replacement bride. Though finding willing candidates proved increasingly challenging, word of Maria Antonia's tragic fate had spread through European royal circles, and several potential matches withdrew their candidacies after receiving detailed briefings about the unique circumstances they might face in a Spanish royal marriage. The negotiations for Ferdinand's second wife revealed the growing diplomatic isolation that his personal dysfunction was creating for Spain. Potential brides began demanding unprecedented concessions, including the right to maintain separate chambers, the presence of their own personal guards, and even escape clauses that would allow them to annul the marriage. Under certain circumstances, Ferdinand's sexual inadequacies had become a liability that threatened Spain's ability to form crucial European alliances through matrimonial politics. Eventually, desperation led Ferdinand's agents to Maria Isabel of Portugal, a Portuguese princess whose family's precarious financial situation made them willing to overlook the notorious reputation of their prospective son-in-law. Isabel was 19 when she arrived in Madrid in 1816, older and more worldly than Maria Antonia had been, but carrying the same doomed hope that had characterized her predecessor's arrival in the Spanish capital. The second wedding ceremony was a more subdued affair, reflecting both the court's exhaustion with royal matrimonial disasters and Ferdinand's advancing age. There were fewer foreign dignitaries in attendance, less elaborate celebrations, and a palpable sense that everyone was merely going through the motions of a ritual that had already proven catastrophically unsuccessful. Isabel had been better prepared for her ordeal than Maria Antonia, having received detailed medical briefings from Portuguese physicians who had consulted with their Spanish counterparts about the unique challenges she would face. Isabel's approach to the marriage was notably more clinical than romantic, treating her royal duties as medical challenges to be solved through scientific methodology rather than expressions of marital affection. She brought her own collection of specialized equipment and preparations, along with a personal physician who had studied the latest European developments in addressing difficult marital situations. This practical mindset served her better than Maria Antonia's naive romanticism, though it could not overcome the fundamental impossibility of Ferdinand's anatomical condition. The second marriage settled into a disturbing pattern of scheduled intimate encounters that resembled surgical procedures more than expressions of love between husband and wife. Isabel kept meticulous records of these sessions, documenting times, techniques, and outcomes with the precision of a research scientist conducting experiments on human endurance. Her clinical detachment seemed to frustrate Ferdinand even more than Maria Antonia's terror had, as he began suspecting that Isabel viewed him as a medical curiosity rather than a legitimate husband and monarch. Ferdinand's paranoia expanded to include fears that Isabel was secretly documenting his condition for foreign intelligence services. His network of spies reported that the Queen maintained extensive correspondence with Portuguese court physicians, sharing what Ferdinand believed were state secrets about his most intimate deficiencies. The king's jealousy and suspicion poisoned what little remained of their already dysfunctional relationship, transforming their marriage into a cold war fought in the shadows of palace corridors. Meanwhile, Spain continued its precipitous decline under Ferdinand's distracted and incompetent rule. The American colonies achieved independence one by one, taking with them the vast wealth that had sustained the Spanish Empire for 3 centuries. Ferdinand's obsession with his sexual dysfunction left him incapable of addressing the political and economic crises tearing his kingdom apart. Cabinet meetings were postponed when the king was having difficult periods with his wife, and crucial governmental decisions were delayed for weeks, while Ferdinand consulted with physicians about new techniques for achieving conception. The Spanish people, initially grateful for Ferdinand's return from exile, began understanding the true cost of their restored monarchy. Revolutions simmered in the cities, while bandits controlled vast stretches of countryside. The king's subjects starved while he spent enormous sums on sexual aids and foreign medical consultants. Spain had become the laughingstock of Europe, its decline symbolized by a ruler whose most intimate failures had become matters of international diplomatic concern and academic study. In 1820, after 4 years of clinical matrimony, Isabel achieved what many observers had considered medically impossible. She became pregnant, sending shockwaves through the Spanish court and across European diplomatic circles, where speculation buzzed about how Ferdinand had finally overcome his notorious anatomical obstacles. Some suggested divine intervention, others credited advances in medical science, while the most cynical observers whispered about potential infidelity and questions of legitimate succession. Ferdinand's reaction to the pregnancy was a mixture of euphoria and terror that bordered on complete madness. He hired additional guards to protect Isabel around the clock, brought in the finest physicians from across Europe to monitor her condition, and had her chambers blessed by every available religious authority in Madrid. The king's desperation to protect this miraculous pregnancy reached pathological levels as he convinced himself that enemies would attempt to sabotage his long-awaited heir through supernatural or scientific means. The pregnancy progressed normally until the 7th month, when Isabel began experiencing complications that palace physicians struggled to understand or treat effectively. Modern medical knowledge suggests she was likely suffering from placental abruption, a condition that might have been manageable with proper care. However, Ferdinand's manic interference with her medical treatment created chaos that made effective intervention nearly impossible. The king insisted on personally supervising every aspect of Isabel's care, despite having no medical training whatsoever, while simultaneously consulting with mystics and alchemists whose advice often contradicted the recommendations of trained physicians. On May 18, 1820, Isabel went into premature labor that lasted nearly 2 full days. The delivery was a horror that traumatized everyone present, as Ferdinand insisted on remaining in the birthing chamber to witness what he hoped would be his moment of ultimate triumph. The baby, a daughter, lived for only a few hours before succumbing to the complications of premature birth. Isabel survived the initial delivery, but never recovered her strength, dying 3 weeks later from what physicians termed childbed fever, but was more likely a combination of infection and despair brought on by the loss of her child. Ferdinand's reaction to this double tragedy revealed the complete breakdown of whatever sanity had remained in his tormented psyche. He refused to allow either body to be buried for nearly a week, insisting that court physicians continue attempting to revive both mother and child through increasingly bizarre and desperate means. The palace filled with the stench of decay as the king denied the reality of his losses and demanded that his medical staff perform impossible resurrections that defied every law of nature and medicine. When Ferdinand finally accepted that his wife and daughter were dead, he fell into a depression so profound that courtiers genuinely feared for his life and the stability of the Spanish throne. He stopped eating, refused to meet with government advisors, and spent entire days staring at the death masks he had commissioned for all 3 of his deceased family members. The king had become a living ghost, haunting his own palace, while Spain crumbled around him, leaderless and rudderless during one of the most critical periods in its long and troubled history. But fate had one final cruel joke to play on the man who had already endured more intimate suffering than seemed humanly possible. In 1829, at the age of 45, Ferdinand found himself facing an unexpected 4th marriage that would prove to be the most bizarre and humiliating chapter in his already nightmarish romantic history. His advisors, desperate to provide some semblance of stability for a kingdom teetering on the edge of complete collapse, had identified Maria Cristina of Naples as a potential bride. What they failed to mention until after the marriage negotiations were finalized was that Maria Cristina arrived in Madrid already carrying another man's child. The 4th wedding, conducted in late 1829, was a farcical spectacle that fooled absolutely no one in attendance. The bride was visibly pregnant as she walked down the aisle, her condition so obvious that even the most naive courtiers understood the impossible mathematics of royal conception. Ferdinand, however, was so desperate for an heir that he willingly embraced this transparent deception. His decades of anatomical failure had driven him to such depths of desperation that he convinced himself divine providence was finally answering his prayers through unconventional means. The king, who had spent his entire adult life unable to produce a single living child, was now prepared to claim paternity of another man's offspring if it meant securing his dynastic succession. The birth of Isabella II in 1830 should have marked the triumphant conclusion of Ferdinand's lifelong quest for legitimate heirs. Instead, it became the source of new anxieties that consumed what remained of his deteriorating sanity. The king knew with mathematical certainty that the child was not his biological offspring, yet he was forced to maintain the elaborate fiction of legitimacy to preserve his crumbling dynasty. Ferdinand's relationship with Maria Cristina was built on a foundation of mutual deception that poisoned every interaction between them. She pretended to respect and honor him, while secretly despising the grotesque figure she had been forced to marry for political convenience. He pretended to believe their daughter was his own flesh and blood, while privately tormented by the knowledge that his greatest political success was simultaneously his most profound personal failure. The king's paranoia during these final years manifested in ways that shocked even the cynical courtiers who had witnessed decades of royal madness, Ferdinand began conducting surprise inspections of Maria Christina's chambers at all hours of the day and night, bursting through doors with armed guards to catch his wife in imagined acts of treason or infidelity. These midnight raids terrified the Queen's ladies in waiting, who never knew when they might find themselves face to face with a wild-eyed monarch wielding accusations of conspiracy. Ferdinand's obsession with surveillance reached grotesque proportions that transformed the royal palace into something resembling a prison more than a home. He had peepholes drilled into the walls between his chambers and Maria Christina's, spending hours pressed against these crude openings, like some perverted voyeur watching his wife's most private moments. Palace servants reported seeing the king's bloodshot eye staring through these holes while Maria Christina nursed their daughter, while she prayed in her private chapel, while she simply sat reading in apparent innocence. The Queen, acutely aware of this constant observation, began moving through her own rooms with the careful deliberation of a prisoner who understood that every gesture was being scrutinized for signs of rebellion or betrayal. Her personal correspondence, intercepted and analyzed by Ferdinand's expanding network of spies, revealed a woman slowly losing her grip on sanity under the relentless pressure of surveillance and suspicion. Food tasting rituals became elaborate ceremonies of paranoia that could delay royal meals for hours at a time. Ferdinand insisted that every dish not only be sampled by official tasters, but that these unfortunate servants wait 30 minutes between testing and serving to ensure any slow-acting poisons would manifest their effects. The king watched these procedures with the intensity of a hawk studying potential prey, scrutinizing every facial expression for signs of distress that might indicate contamination. Several tasters collapsed from nervous exhaustion under this constant scrutiny, their visible anxiety only reinforcing Ferdinand's conviction that assassination attempts were imminent. The elaborate security measures surrounding something as basic as royal dining became symbols of a monarchy that had lost all connection to rational governance, where paranoia had replaced policy as the driving force behind royal decision-making. Maria Christina's letters to her family in Naples, those few that escaped Ferdinand's censorship, painted a picture of psychological torture that rivaled anything devised by professional interrogators. She described feeling constantly watched, jumping at shadows, finding herself unable to trust even her most loyal servants. The Queen wrote of existing in what she called a glass cage, where every breath was monitored for signs of disloyalty or deception. Ferdinand's paranoia extended far beyond his immediate family to encompass the entire structure of Spanish court life. He began rotating his personal guards on a daily basis, convinced that prolonged service would inevitably lead to corruption by enemy agents seeking to exploit their access to royal chambers. Cabinet ministers found themselves subjected to loyalty tests that bordered on the absurd, with Ferdinand making deliberately contradictory statements in private meetings to see if his advisors would dare correct him. The Spanish court, once renowned throughout Europe for its sophisticated etiquette and cultural refinement, devolved into a bizarre theatre of mutual surveillance, where everyone understood that survival depended on maintaining absolute neutrality in the face of royal madness. Conversations were conducted in careful whispers, relationships formed and dissolved based on perceived loyalty to competing factions, and the simple act of expressing an opinion could result in exile or imprisonment. Ferdinand's relationship with his infant daughter Isabella became another source of pathological anxiety that consumed enormous amounts of his already limited mental energy. Despite knowing she was not his biological child, he simultaneously loved her as his designated heir and resented her as living evidence of his sexual failures. The king would spend hours staring at the baby, searching her developing features for signs of resemblance to himself or to the unknown men who might be her actual father. He commissioned teams of artists to create detailed portraits of Isabella at various stages of infancy, comparing these images obsessively to paintings of himself, Maria Christina, and various suspected lovers who might have sired his supposed heir. The question of Isabella's true paternity tormented Ferdinand with particular intensity, because it represented the ultimate triumph of his anatomical dysfunction over his royal duties. The irony was not lost on the king that his greatest political achievement in securing the succession was simultaneously his most profound personal humiliation. Here was a child who would inherit his throne precisely because he had been unable to produce legitimate offspring through normal means. This contradiction ate at him like acid, poisoning his few moments of genuine affection for the daughter who represented both his dynastic salvation and his intimate damnation. Ferdinand VII died in 1833, his body finally succumbing to decades of psychological torment and physical dysfunction. The autopsy revealed the full horror of his anatomical curse, an organ so grotesquely deformed that normal intimacy had been medically impossible. His preserved remains, sealed away in Vatican archives, stand as a monument to the destructive power of shame and unchecked authority. The king who destroyed 3 wives, terrorized a nation, and lost an empire had finally achieved peace through death's merciful release.